Hello painting students. So here I've got my frog example. Remember I did my background with watercolors and I used some of the techniques that we had learned so that I was incorporating shape and value really and texture all just within that one part of the background. And then I've got shape and value and space with my foreground being in front of that. So now I've done this with watercolor, I've done this with acrylic, and now I'm going to work on painting my frog. And remember that it is very important that you have your reference image in front of you, especially once you are on sort of the animal painting stage, simply because there is going to be a lot of detail, shading, value, color transitions, things like that, that you're going to need to be able to look at in order to make them accurate. So the first step is going to be sort of just background painting, sort of undertone. So none of this is going to be super detailed yet. I've got just little bits of my colors because remember you do not need a lot of anything, especially towards the beginning. And I'm just going to go ahead and scoop a little bit of my white and a little bit of my peachy color because that's going to make the color that I need for his stomach because it's sort of a whitish peach color. There is a little bit of blue mixed in parts of that, so I am going to go ahead and scoop a little bit of that to the side and just get a little blue in there. And if you get too much blue, kind of like I just did, just add to it. It'll be okay. You can get more color, but you don't want to start with too much. I'm going to continue mixing that. It's getting pretty close to what I need because it's kind of a grayish, bluish color, but it has a bit of a peach tint to it. So that's kind of the color I'm going for here. Remember to rinse your brush off between mixing colors, or if you need to make a lighter version, you can use that directly into the white. For me, I need to make a whole separate color now because I need to make my green much more of a vibrant type of green. So I've got some yellow. I went ahead and used the neon yellow, scooping some green in. I'm going to mix those two together. So that's starting to get there, but it does still need to be a little bit more yellow and some white. And parts of my green will have a little bit of blue mixed in, but I don't necessarily need to pre-mix that. I could certainly just scoop a little bit of this section of my green with the white already mixed in, with some of that yellow mixed in, put a little bit of blue in there, and mix another section of color here. Maybe add a little more of my yellow to that. So the color mixing part is a whole process in and of itself. So I just wanted you guys to see a little bit of that color mixing process just so that you would know that it's okay to pre-mix your colors. It's okay to add to your palette. But you do not want to start with too much because then you will waste some of it. So now I'm going to go ahead and start with a relatively small brush here. I'm going to start just like we would from the background and any other type of painting. I'm going to start with whatever's furthest back. So I'm going to start with this back leg and then work my way up so that the eyes would be the last thing I do. So most of the back leg here is just kind of a dark blue on the top part. So right now I'm not too crazy worried about shading or detail. I'm more concerned just about getting the color on there. Still looking at my reference image a lot as I'm working, and there is some white on the top here. So I am going to go ahead and mix some white directly onto the paper. Now keep in mind, with acrylic paint, you can sort of add white towards the end. It's still a good idea to go ahead and indicate where you're going to be needing the white, but it's okay if you don't have that light value in there yet. Because you can, since acrylic is opaque, you can go back in and add that white later. So once again, right now I'm just working on sort of that underpainting. So it's going to have some detail. Some of my color transitions are going to be in there, but not all of them. So not all of the shading, not all of the color or detail yet. And then it does have some red down here on this portion of the leg. But I can't pinpoint exactly where it stops and starts without looking really closely. So for now, I'm just going to kind of put some red in there and have it blend into the blue. It does get a little bit more into a yellowy, sort of orangey color. Got a little too much green on my brush. Because there is a bit of a lighter spot on this part of the leg down here. And then this is where it's the most red. But then it does get back to blue here. It's a pretty dark blue in between. There's a bit of a darker blue up here as well. And then I'm going to rinse my brush and get a little more of that regular blue on there. So you'll see it's basically a combination of mixing in advance, so pre-mixing, and mixing directly onto the paper while the colors are wet enough to blend. Notice also that I am drying my brush off each time I change colors or rinse it out, because I don't want to have a whole bunch of unnecessary water in my paint. Because what that's going to do is thin out the acrylic probably more than what you want. So then I've got some of my green here. Not much of the green on this leg. Most of this leg is blue. So now I'm going to go ahead and go back in with my blue. Sort of like on the kneecap area. Fade that into the green a bit. Go back in with my red under here a little bit. And I'm going to turn my page, rinse my brush, because there is a little bit of green on the bottom of that kneecap. So I'm going to dry my brush, put a little bit of that bluer green down here. And then it's going to go back to blue for this part of the leg primarily. I'm going to leave a little gap there because there's some red, but it's also a highlight. Gonna add in a little bit of a lighter blue here. And you could definitely tape back off, like I could put tape on this orange section again so that I don't accidentally get my blue there, or you can be careful. Gonna add a little more of my lighter blue here because it does get lighter in this particular part. And then there's green along this edge. So I'm going to go ahead and put some green in there. Kind of comes along the front of the foot, gets more of that yellowy green. And then that yellowy green sort of wraps into the front of the foot here, and then that will eventually be a lot more of a red and orange sort of combination. But right now I've got to finish up this little spot here where it's that lighter blue. But it's also blending into that green. Then it goes back to the darker blue right along the edge of the foot here. Still keeping that green handy because I am going to be painting back over the blue again with the green so that I get a transition in there. And then the rest of the foot is mostly red and orange, so I'm going to actually let that dry before I get to that part. I'm going to go ahead and work on this arm, or I could go ahead and work on his belly because the belly is behind the arm. So I think I'll do that. Rinse off and dry off my brush. And then most of the belly is that sort of pinky flesh color, but it does have some shading in there. But for now, I'm going to focus primarily on just blocking it in with that flesh type of color. There is a little bit of shading, especially along the edge of the arms, to show where the shadows are, but I can always do that in a subsequent layer a little bit more effectively. It does have a little bit of that bluish color right up in here. There's a bit of a lighter spot here, so I'm going to use some white. Along this edge, there's also a lighter spot, so I'm going to use more white. And like I said, a lot of the stomach will eventually have darker values in it. So I would be adding some blacks or even some purples into some of those shadows. Typically more blue and purple than black though. So kind of keep that in mind. So then his sort of armpit area has some of that blue in it. And then there's quite a bit of blue along this section. So I'm going to make it sort of a light blue for now, even though parts of it will definitely be darker. So like I said, none of these colors or values are exactly what I need or want them to be, but since this is my underpainting, I'm more concerned about getting the idea of it all on there, and then going back with subsequent layers to make things more accurate and more detailed. So a lot of stuff will change before this painting is finished. But you can see that it's starting to get a little bit of volume, starting to get a little bit of depth, because I am using a little bit of shading the whole time. Because then the more you layer up the shading, the more you layer up the detail, the more accurate and realistic your painting will be, which is what we're going for with this piece. So again, constantly looking at that reference image. You will hear me say that a lot because it's really important. Because no matter how familiar you are with what you were painting, you cannot paint it in a way that really looks representative of what it is if you're not looking at it. And then it gets a little bit of that peachy color back on the bottom part of his lip here. So I know that a lot of this is still going to change. It's going to look very different than what it looks like right now. But it's a good start to indicate sort of what I'm going for. Gonna go in with just a little bit of that darker blue up here. Even though I do need it to be dulled down, it's not quite as teal as this. So subsequent layers, I will use a less teal blue, and then they'll work together to create the value and the color that I need them to. Because similarly to when you're shading with a pencil, your first layer is not necessarily going to be the actual value or the coloration that you need. All the layers work together to create what you're going for. So your first layer, just like this one, might look really rough. It might not make a lot of sense. But then as you continue to work and look at your reference image and add more and more detail while you are looking closely, you will eventually start to make it look more like what you're painting. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of green on this edge. And acrylic paint does dry pretty quickly, which is another reason why we don't want to mix too much more than what we need at any given time, because otherwise there'll just be a lot of it that we're not able to use. So this arm has more of this bluish green on the outside, and then more of that limey green more toward the inside. So we're going to go directly over that blue-green with the lime green. Let them start to blend together a bit. Then I do have some white that comes in right about here before I get to the blue section of that arm. So you can see that this is the shading technique that I was showing you on this portion. Same concept. And once again, this is not as smooth as I will eventually have the painting because it's a frog. I do want it to still have that same smoothness that a frog should have. But my first layer is not the time to worry so much about the smoothness as it is about getting the colors in the right spot. The smoothness will come more with subsequent layers. Now that does not mean that you want your first layer to be sloppy by any means. You still want that first layer to be nice and neat and starting to develop the smoothment. Gonna go in with my white in between these two colors a little bit more. And then again, this arm, this hand, is mostly that red and orange combination. So I'm just going to kind of smooth this in a little more into my green on the bottom part and into my blue on the upper part. So that might be sort of the beginning of the frog. I've got the beginning of this arm, I've got the beginning of the leg, I've got the stomach started, and then I would go ahead and continue along with the outer part, the top of the head, the green part of the arm, and then I can do the reds and the oranges sort of after all of that is dry as a whole separate thing.